Singlestick, also known as cudgels, refers to both a martial art that uses a wooden stick as well as the weapon used in the art. It began as a way of training sailors in the use of swords such as the saber or the cutlass.Canne. Combat, a French form of stick fighting, is similar to single-stick play, but is more a method of self-defense with a walking stick. Weapon. The single stick itself is a slender, round wooden rod, traditionally ovash, with a basket hilt. Single sticks are typically around 36 inches in length and 1 inch in diameter and thicker at one end than the other. It bears approximately the same relationship to the backsword as the foil to the small sword in being a sporting version of the weapon for safe practice. The original form of the single stick was the waster, which appeared in the 16th century and was merely a wooden sword used in practice for the backsword, and of the same general shape. By the first quarter of the 17th century, wasters had become simple clubs known as cudgels with the addition of a sword guard. When the basket hilt came into general use about 25 years later, a wicker one was added to the single stick, replacing the heavy metal hilt of the backsword. The guards, cuts and parries in single-stick play were at first identical with those of backsword play, no thrusts being allowed. History and technique. In 16th century England, hits below the girdle were considered unfair. In the 18th century, all parts of the person became valid targets. By the turn of the 19th century, the target area had been restricted to the upper body and the upper part of the forward leg. These rules are in use today by the Association for Historical Fencing. Historically, the target area has varied, with bouts sometimes only being decided by the drawing of blood from the head of one of the contestants, in the manner of the mensure. Under Kings George I and George II, backsword play with sticks was immensely popular under the names cudgel play and single-sticking, not only in the cities but in the countryside as well, wrestling being its only rival. Towards the end of the 18th century, the play became very restricted. The players were placed near together, the feet remaining immovable and all strokes being delivered with a whip-like action of the wrist from a high-hanging guard, the hand being held above the head. Blows on any part of the body above the waist were allowed, but all except those aimed at the head were employed only to gain openings, as each bout was decided only by a broken head, i.e. a cut on the head that drew blood. At first the left hand and arm were used to ward off blows not parried with the stick, but near the close of the 18th century the left hand grasped a scarf tied loosely round the left thigh, the elbow being raised to protect the face. Thomas Hughes's story Tom Brown's School Days contains a spirited description of cudgel play during the first half of the 19th century. This kind of single-sticking practically died out during the third quarter of that century, but was revived as weapon training for the saber within some military and civilian academies, the play being essentially the same as for that weapon. The point was introduced and leg hits were allowed. American President Theodore Roosevelt and his friend General Leonard Wood were fond of this sport and used to emerge from a contest quite braced for the rounds. However, doubt has been raised on this theory. It is very unlikely that Theodore Roosevelt or General Wood ever practiced the British sport of single-stick, but more likely the French art of Canne combat. Indeed, their own fencing instructor Maître François Dariulet was a graduate of the French army, where single-stick was unknown but cane was mandatory for officers, and many other facts tend to point out that situation. Single-stick was an event at the 1904 Summer Olympics, but the sport was already in decline. Again, recent investigation found that most likely single-stick was not present at the 1904 Olympics, but rather a form of cane fighting. Singlestick was very seldom taught in late 19th century America until it was introduced for a short while in Annapolis, and most of the competitors came from academies where singlestick was unknown but French cane was taught. The use of the term singlestick in contemporary newspapers explains the confusion, as it was an umbrella term at the time to refer to combat sports and games using a stick such as singlestick, cane, quarterstaff, or even kendo. With the introduction of the light Italian fencing saber in the early 20th century, singlestick play became unnecessary and was subsequently neglected. In the UK, singlestick competitions ceased in the services in the 1950s, although the skills continued to be passed down from one generation of fencing professor to the next. Stick play with wooden swords as a school for the cutlass remained common in some navies. The art, occasionally practiced by a few fencing veterans in the United Kingdom, was revived by the Royal Navy in the 1980s. Within today's martial arts community, a growing interest in traditional Western martial arts has revived interest in this particular form of weapon training. In popular culture, in a study in Scarlet, Dr. Watson notes in his list Sherlock Holmes, his limits, that Holmes is an expert boxer, singlestick player, and swordsman. A modern-day Sherlock Holmes in the CBS TV series Elementary regularly practices singlestick. In Street Fighter, the English noble character Eagle uses this martial art.